There is a candle in the window at the end of Elderbrook Lane, and it has burned there every night for 30 years. No one in Hollowmere knows who Margaret Fenwick is waiting for. They only know that she lights the candle before dusk, every evening without fail, and that whenever an unfamiliar footstep sounds outside her gate, the old widow still looks toward the door. It is not the kind of question you ask a person like Margaret. There is something about the way she carries herself, something quietly private beneath the kindness, that makes even the most curious among them hold their tongue. The children used to ask their mothers why the widow's window always glowed after dusk, and the mothers, more often than not, would simply say, "That is Margaret's candle, dear," and leave it there, as though the words themselves were an answer. But the truth is, nobody quite remembers when the asking stopped, only that somewhere along the years, the candle became less of a mystery to be solved and more of a quiet fact of village life, the way the church bell tolls at 6, or the way frost gathers first on the low stone wall by the bridge. Hollowmere at dusk has a particular kind of stillness to it, the kind that settles gently over rooftops and hedgerows as the last light drains slowly from the sky. Smoke curls upward from a dozen chimneys, pale against the deepening blue, and somewhere down near the mill pond a dog barks once and falls quiet again. The lane grows soft underfoot, damp with the day's last rain, and the hedgerows along its edges seem to hold their shape a little longer than the rest of the world, as though reluctant to let the day go. It is in this hush, this in-between hour neither quite day nor quite night, that Margaret's candle first appears in the window, small and steady, a single point of warmth against the coming dark. No one asks what happened some 30 years ago that first set her hand to match and wick. And no one, not even Constance, her oldest friend in the village, has ever asked why Margaret's shoulders draw in ever so slightly, just for a moment, before she remembers herself and turns quietly back to her tea. Margaret Fenwick's days begin, as they have for longer than most in Hollowmere can recall, with the slow business of tending a small garden that seems, against all reason, to bloom more generously than gardens twice its size. Rosemary grows thick along the low stone border, its scent catching on the morning air the moment she brushes past it with the hem of her shawl. Lavender leans heavy in high summer, and even in the colder months there is always something green managing to survive beneath the frost, as though the garden itself had learned patience from its keeper. She moves through it each morning with an unhurried certainty, pulling a weed here, tying back a stem there, pausing now and then simply to look at what she has grown, the way a person looks at something they have loved for a very long time. There is no clock to her mornings, only the light itself, thin and gray at first, warming slowly as she works, and by the time the church bell sounds the hour she is usually seated on the small bench by the door, brushing the soil from her hands and watching the lane begin to stir. On Wednesdays, without fail, she bakes bread, and the smell of it drifts out through her kitchen window and down the length of Elderbrook Lane long before the loaves are done. Half of what she bakes never stays in her own kitchen at all. She wraps a warm loaf in cloth and carries it 2 doors down to old Mrs. Pruitt, who lives alone much as Margaret does, and the 2 women sit together for a quarter of an hour over tea, saying little of consequence and yet seeming, each time, a little lighter for the visit. Mrs. Pruitt has known Margaret longer than almost anyone left in the village, long enough to remember her as a younger woman, though she has never once spoken of those years aloud, as if some unspoken agreement had settled between them decades ago and never needed renewing. It is one of the small, steady threads that hold Margaret's days together, this quiet passing of warmth from one doorstep to the next, and the village has come to expect it the way it expects the seasons to turn. The grocer's boy, a freckled lad named Charlie Doyle who cannot be more than 12, brings her flour and tea leaves every Friday afternoon, and Margaret always presses a coin into his palm that is worth rather more than the errand deserves. He never argues. He has learned, as most of Hollowmere has learned, that it is easier to accept Margaret's kindness than to refuse it, and that she seems to take a quiet joy in the giving of it that would be a shame to deny her. He lingers sometimes on her step, telling her some small piece of village news, the state of the mill pond, a new litter of kittens at the bakery, and she listens with the kind of attention most adults reserve for people they consider important, which perhaps is why Charlie always seems to walk a little taller on his way back down the lane. Once, without quite meaning to, he asked her why her window always glowed after dark, and Margaret only smiled and told him that some habits simply outlive their reasons, an answer that satisfied him completely, the way only a child's curiosity can be satisfied by something that sounds wise without truly explaining anything at all. He has never asked again, though he sometimes glances at the window on his way home, as if hoping the glow might explain itself in its own time. Her oldest friend in the village is Constance Whitmore, a woman of similar years who lost her own husband to fever many winters ago, and who understands, better than anyone, the particular shape of a quiet house. Constance visits on Sunday afternoons, arriving with whatever small thing she has baked or knitted that week, and the two women sit by Margaret's window as the light softens outside, speaking of nothing much and everything at once: the price of wool, the vicar's latest sermon, the state of the roses. There is an ease between them that neither has ever needed to explain. The ease of two people who have grieved in their own private ways and found, somehow, a kind of companionship on the other side of it. Constance never asks about the candle. She has simply always understood, without needing the words, that some things are carried rather than spoken, and that friendship, at its best, asks nothing more than to sit beside a person in their silence. On the coldest evenings she stays a little longer than usual, and neither woman ever remarks on it, though both seem grateful for the extra warmth of company against the dark. The vicar, a soft-spoken man named Edmund Sayer, greets Margaret warmly whenever their paths cross near the church or the market square, and yet there is something in the way his eyes pass briefly over her window each evening, something that suggests he, too, carries a piece of whatever story the candle belongs to. He has never pressed her for it. He simply nods, the way the rest of the village nods, and moves on, though those who watch closely might notice that his nod lingers a moment longer than most, and that his step, just after, seems a little heavier for the passing, as though the sight of that small flame stirred something in him that he has long chosen not to name. As evening settles over Hollowmere once more, Margaret takes her usual place by the window with a cup of tea gone lukewarm in her hands, watching the lane grow quiet, watching the last of the villagers make their way home before dark, coats drawn close against the chill, lanterns swinging gently at their sides. It is a life built from small, steady comforts, bread and rosemary and Sunday afternoons, and if you have found your own way to this quiet corner of the story, to this lane and this candle and this woman who has spent 30 years watching the door, perhaps you would like to stay here a while longer with us. There is no need to do anything more than settle in. The evenings in Hollowmere have a way of unfolding gently, one at a time, for anyone willing to listen, and there is always room by the window for one more. There are, too, the quieter hours of Margaret's week that no one but she herself ever fully witnesses, the early mornings before even the baker's boy is stirring, when she walks the length of her garden with a cup of tea cooling untouched in her hand, simply looking, the way a person looks at something they have tended so long it has become almost an extension of themselves. The frost, in these coldest months, silvers every leaf and stem before the sun climbs high enough to soften it, and Margaret has come to know this particular hour of the morning better than almost any other, the hush of it, the way the whole lane seems to hold its breath before the day properly begins. She keeps, too, a small collection of habits that the village has come to associate with her as surely as they associate the candle itself. The particular way she ties her shawl before stepping out to the garden, the small nod she gives the church spire each morning as though greeting an old friend, the careful manner in which she waters her rosemary before anything else, as though it were the first order of business any day could reasonably demand of her. These small rituals, taken together, form a kind of quiet architecture to her days, steady and dependable, the sort of structure a life builds around itself not through grand design but through the simple, patient repetition of small, sustaining acts. The lane itself seems to know her rhythms as well as she knows them, the baker's boy adjusting his round so that her loaf collection falls always at the same hour, the postman, on the rare occasions letters come at all, learning long ago to leave them tucked just so beneath her garden gate rather than risk disturbing whatever quiet task she might be engaged in. It is the particular gift of a small village, this mutual, wordless accommodation, neighbors shaping their own small habits around the habits of others until the whole lane moves together in a kind of unspoken harmony, one that visitors passing through on market days often remark upon without quite being able to say what, precisely, makes Elderbrook Lane feel so different from any other lane they have known. Margaret Fenwick was not born on Elderbrook Lane, though it has been so long since she arrived that most of the village has forgotten she came from anywhere else at all. She grew up several miles beyond Hollowmere, in a smaller hamlet nearer the coast, the daughter of a miller who kept a quiet house and a mother who taught her to press rosemary flat between the pages of a heavy book, a habit Margaret carried with her long after she left her girlhood home behind. She was, by every account of those who remember her as a young woman, cheerful in a soft and unhurried way, the sort of girl who noticed small things, the particular blue of a winter sky, the sound rain made on a tin roof, and who seemed to carry a kind of stillness in her even then, long before life gave her any real reason to be still. Her mother used to say that Margaret listened to the world the way other children only looked at it, and perhaps that was true, for she grew into a woman who noticed everything and asked for very little. She met Thomas Fenwick at a harvest gathering the autumn she turned 19, in the coastal town where he worked the harbor trade, loading and unloading the merchant vessels that came and went with the tides. He was a steady man, unhurried in his own way, with broad hands roughened by rope and salt, and a manner of speaking that made even ordinary things sound carefully considered. He was not a man of grand gestures. He did not court her with poetry or promises he could not keep. Instead, he brought her small, practical kindnesses, a length of good wool when the winter turned sharp, a jar of honey from a trade he had struck with a beekeeper near the docks, and Margaret found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she had fallen in love with him precisely because of how little he asked of her and how much he simply gave. He wore, even then, a heavy navy coat that had belonged to his own father before him, a coat she would come to know the weight and smell of as well as she knew her own hands, wool and salt and something faintly of tar from the harbor ropes. They married 2 years later in the small stone church nearest the harbor, the same church whose bell, faint and distant, could still be heard on clear evenings all the way from the cottage on Elderbrook Lane, a sound that would come to mark the passing of Margaret's days for the rest of her life. Thomas brought her back to Hollowmere after the wedding, to the cottage that had belonged to his late mother, a modest home with good bones and a garden gone to seed that Margaret set about reviving within her first season there. It was in those early years that many of their small rituals were born, rituals that Margaret has carried forward, quietly and faithfully, in the decades since. Thomas had a habit of leaving her a sprig of rosemary on the kitchen sill whenever his work called him away for more than a day or two, a small green promise that he intended to return, and Margaret took to pressing each one flat between the pages of her mother's old Bible, just as her mother had taught her, until the book grew thick with them, a private record of every parting and every homecoming a married life requires. In the evenings, when he was home, Thomas would sometimes take her hand in the kitchen and turn her slowly in a few unpracticed steps, humming some tune half-remembered from his own childhood, and Margaret would laugh, not because he danced well, for he most certainly did not, but because there was something in the earnestness of it, the plain, unhidden tenderness of a man who loved his wife and was not ashamed to show it in the privacy of their own kitchen. Sundays were spent much as Constance and Margaret spend them still, though then it was Thomas beside her rather than her old friend, walking the lane after church, stopping to admire whichever garden along the way was blooming best that week. Margaret always insisting hers would surpass it by summer's end. Thomas always agreeing with the easy patience of a man who had learned long ago that some arguments were better won by yielding. Their joys were small ones. A good harvest. A quiet Sunday. The garden coming into bloom each spring a little fuller than the year before. A letter from Thomas's cousin up the coast. Read aloud together by the fire. They spoke often of a future neither of them rushed toward. A house full of grandchildren someday. A garden grown wild and generous with age. The two of them older and slower but still together, still turning in that same clumsy kitchen dance long after their hair had gone gray. It was not an extraordinary life they imagined. It was simply theirs, and that had always seemed enough. Margaret sometimes says, when Constance asks her gently about those years, that she never once felt she was waiting for her life to begin. It had already begun, she says, the very day Thomas brought her up the lane to the cottage with the overgrown garden, and everything since has only been the long, quiet unfolding of it. The harbor trade took Thomas away with some regularity, sometimes for a week, sometimes for the better part of a month, and Margaret had long grown accustomed to these absences, marking the days on a small calendar she kept by the window, watching for the particular shape of his walk coming up the lane, the slight roll to his gait that never quite left him even years after he'd stopped working the ship's day to day. It was in the autumn of her 34th year that he set out on what should have been an ordinary voyage, a trading run up the coast that he had made a dozen times before without incident, kissing her goodbye at the gate with the same unhurried certainty he brought to everything, and leaving, as always, a sprig of rosemary on the sill, and his good coat hanging by the door, for the weather along that stretch of coast rarely called for it in early autumn. The ship was due back within the fortnight. Margaret remembers marking the date on her calendar with a small, hopeful circle, remembers the particular quality of the light that morning, pale and gold across the garden, remembers thinking, without any real cause for worry, that she ought to have supper ready early in case he arrived before dusk. She remembers, too, that the church bell tolled 6 that evening just as it always did, and that she found herself listening to it a little more closely than usual, though she could not have said why. The fortnight came and went, and the ship did not return. Word came slowly to a village as small as Hollowmere, carried by traders and travelers who knew only fragments, that the vessel had been delayed by weather along the northern coast. Nothing more troubling than that, the kind of delay that happened often enough in that trade and was rarely cause for alarm. Margaret waited a second week, then a third, telling herself each morning that today would surely bring news, that the delay was ordinary, that Thomas would come walking up the lane any evening now with some long, ordinary story about rough seas and lost time. A story she could scold him for gently over supper before forgiving him entirely by the time the fire burned low. It was somewhere in that third week, as the light began to turn earlier and the evenings grew longer and colder, that Margaret first placed a lit candle in the front window before she went to bed, telling herself it was simply so that Thomas, should he arrive late in the night, would see at once that he was expected and welcome, that the house had not gone dark and cold in his absence. It was a small, practical gesture, born of nothing more than a wife's habit of tending the hearth for a husband on his way home. She hung his good coat back by the door where he had left it, brushed the shoulders clean of dust though it had gathered none, and told herself she was only being sensible, only doing what any wife would do while she waited. She could not have known, that first night, how many nights would follow it. Constance Whitmore, who was newly widowed herself that same autumn, having lost her own husband to a fever that swept through the village the previous winter, understood something of what those weeks of waiting cost Margaret, though even she, closest of all Margaret's friends, has never known the particulars of what came after. Constance had her own candle once, in her own window, lit through the long weeks of her husband's illness in the hope that some fever-broken morning he might wake and see it and know how fiercely he was loved and wanted to stay. She remembers those weeks with a clarity that still catches in her throat sometimes, the smell of the sickroom, the sound of her husband's labored breathing through the wall, the candle burning low each night as she prayed for a morning that never quite came the way she needed it to. Hers went dark the night he died, and she remembers, too, the strange mercy of finally being able to sleep without listening for his breath. Margaret's candle, for reasons the village has long since stopped asking about, has never gone dark at all, not once, not in 30 years, through every winter storm and every summer's long light, through illnesses of her own that might have excused a single missed night, through the death of nearly everyone else who might have remembered why it began. And it is perhaps because Constance carries her own quiet understanding of what it means to keep a light burning for someone that she has never once pressed her oldest friend to explain why hers has burned for so very much longer, or what exactly 30 years of waiting is meant to accomplish, or whether Margaret herself still believes, on the coldest and darkest of those nights, that the light might yet be seen by the one it was lit for. There were, in those first months of waiting, others in Hollowmere who tried, gently, to comfort her toward an ending she was not yet prepared to accept. An old sailor named Warwick, who had worked the same harbor trade in his younger years, came to call on her that winter with his hat in his hands in a careful, sorrowful manner and told her, as kindly as such things can be told, that ships were sometimes lost along that stretch of coast in autumn storms, that it happened more often than anyone liked to speak of, and that perhaps, in time, she might find some peace in accepting what the silence seemed to suggest. Margaret thanked him for his honesty. She made him tea and asked after his own family and sent him home with a loaf of bread, and she has never once, in 30 years, spoken of that visit to another living soul, though Constance has always suspected it happened, has always sensed some private grief in Margaret that predates even the candle itself. Something Margaret carries the way she carries the pressed rosemary in her mother's Bible, folded flat and kept close and never quite spoken aloud. It was around that same time that the church bell began to take on its particular weight in Margaret's evenings. Thomas had once told her, early in their marriage, half in jest, that a harbor man always knows the hour by the bells of whatever town he is nearest, that the sound carries differently over water than over land, softer somehow, and that he would know Hollowmere's bell anywhere, would recognize it even blindfolded from any ship in the bay. Margaret took to listening for it each evening after his disappearance, at first out of habit, and then, as the weeks became months and the months became years, out of something closer to ritual, a way of marking that another day had passed and the candle would need lighting again, and beneath that, unspoken even to herself, a small and stubborn hope that the sound might somehow carry all the way to wherever Thomas was, and call him home the way it had always called him home before. The garden, too, became something more than a garden in those years. Margaret had always tended it with care, but after Thomas's disappearance she began to tend it with a kind of devotion that the village noticed even if it never remarked upon it directly, planting rosemary in greater quantity than any household could reasonably use, until the scent of it hung over the whole of Elderbrook Lane on warm evenings, thick and green and unmistakable. She has never explained why, and no one has ever asked, though those who know her best have long suspected that each new plant was its own small act of pressing something flat and keeping it close, the way her mother once taught her, the way she has done with every sprig Thomas ever left her. A garden grown entirely from the language of a promise she has never stopped believing in. It was late autumn again, 30 years almost to the season since Thomas Fenwick had last walked up Elderbrook Lane, when a stranger first appeared at the far end of it, moving slowly, as strangers in Hollowmere always seemed to, taking in the low stone walls and the smoke curling from the chimneys as though he were reading a page he had long wondered about but never quite dared to open. He was a young man, perhaps 30, dressed plainly but well, with the kind of careful, unhurried manner that made the villagers who noticed him assume, correctly, that he had come a considerable distance and did not intend to leave again before dark. He introduced himself at the inn as Peter Ashford, and told the innkeeper, when asked his business, only that he was looking into some old harbor records on behalf of his late employer's estate, and that his search had led him, eventually, to Hollowmere. News of a stranger in the village travels quickly along Elderbrook Lane, faster even than the smell of Margaret's Wednesday bread, and by the time Charlie Doyle came round with her flower that Friday afternoon, he was fairly bursting with the report of it. A gentleman at the inn, he told her, asking questions about old harbor names, about ships that had gone missing along the northern coast years and years ago, and Charlie, being 12 and full of the easy confidence of youth, had already decided the whole affair was tremendously exciting, though he could not have said exactly why. Margaret listened to him with her usual patience, thanked him for the flower, and said nothing at all about the small, familiar unease that had settled somewhere beneath her ribs the moment he mentioned ships and the northern coast in the same breath. She told herself, that evening, as she lit the candle in its usual place, that Hollowmere had seen strangers before, that harbor business drew all manner of clerks and researchers through villages like this one from time to time, settling old accounts and closing old ledgers, and that there was no particular reason to imagine the stranger's business had anything to do with her own quiet, unremarkable life. And yet she found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, glancing toward the window rather more often than the evening required, watching the lane for a shape that was not, she reminded herself firmly, the shape she had spent 30 years watching for. Peter Ashford came to her gate the following afternoon. She had been in the garden when she heard the latch, and she straightened slowly, brushing the soil from her hands in the same unhurried way she always did, and turned to find a young man standing just inside the gate with his hat already removed, holding it against his chest in a manner that struck her at once as careful, almost apologetic, the manner of someone who understood he was about to disturb something he did not fully understand. He introduced himself and explained, in a voice pitched low and gentle, that he had come from the shipping offices some considerable distance to the north, where he had spent the better part of 2 years cataloging old harbor records for a company that had recently changed hands, records that had sat undisturbed in a warehouse for decades before anyone thought to open them again. Margaret invited him in for tea, as she would have invited anyone to her door, though her hands, she noticed distantly, were not quite as steady as usual as she filled the kettle. Peter sat at her kitchen table, glancing once, briefly, at the naval coat still hanging by the door, though he said nothing of it, and explained, slowly and with evident care for how his words might land, that among the records he had been cataloging were the personal effects of several crew members from a vessel that had gone down in a storm off the northern coast some 30 years before, effects that had been recovered afterward but never properly returned to the families, lost somewhere in the confusion of a shipping company's changing hands and the slow passage of years. He had spent the better part of a month tracing names against old parish registers, he told her, trying to find where these small, forgotten things might still belong. He had, he said, a box. It was a modest thing, unremarkable to look at, wooden and weathered, the kind of box a sailor might have kept his few personal belongings in aboard ship, and Peter set it carefully on the kitchen table between them, though he did not open it and did not press her to open it either. He explained, gently, that the box had been listed under the name Fenwick, that he had traced the parish records back to Hollowmere, and that he had come, as much as anything, simply to ask whether she was the woman he believed her to be, and whether she wished to have it. Margaret sat looking at the box for a long moment before she answered him, and when she finally spoke, Her voice was steadier than she expected it to be, though something in her chest had gone very tight and very quiet, the way the air goes still before a change in weather. She told him simply that yes, she was Thomas Fenwick's wife, and that she would very much like to have it, though she found, when she reached out to touch the lid, that her hand would not quite close around it. Not yet, not with a stranger still seated across her own kitchen table. Peter, to his credit, seemed to understand this without needing to be told. He rose, gathered his hat, and said only that he would leave the box with her, that there was no obligation to open it before she felt ready, and that he was sorry, truly sorry, for whatever grief it might stir in the opening of it. He told her, too, before he left, that the shipping company's records had been remarkably thorough in some respects and frustratingly incomplete in others, that there were still gaps in what had happened to that particular vessel that no ledger had ever fully explained, and that if she ever wished to know more of what he had found in his research, she had only to send word to the inn, where he intended to stay a few days more before continuing his work elsewhere. She thanked him. She saw him to the gate. And then she stood for a long while in her own garden, in the last of the afternoon light, looking back at her kitchen window, where the small wooden box sat exactly where he had left it, unopened on the table. She did not open it that evening. She made her tea as she always did, and sat by the window as she always did, and lit the candle at its usual hour, though her eyes kept returning again and again to the shape of the box on the table behind her, visible at the edge of her sight even as she watched the lane grow dark and quiet. Constance came by unexpectedly that night, drawn perhaps by nothing more than an old friend's instinct that something in the village air had shifted, and found Margaret sitting very still by the window with her tea gone cold in her hands. Constance did not ask about the box directly. She had heard, of course, as the whole village had heard by then, about the stranger and his inquiries at the inn, and she understood well enough, without needing it spelled out, what a wooden box bearing the name Fenwick might mean to a woman who had spent 30 years lighting a candle for a man lost at sea. She sat with Margaret instead, saying little, refilling the kettle when the tea went cold a second time, and simply stayed, the way she had learned, over her own long years of grief, that staying was very often the kindest thing a friend could do. It was well past midnight when Constance finally rose to leave, and at the door she paused, her hand on the latch, and asked Margaret gently whether she intended to open it. Margaret looked back toward the table, toward the small, weathered box sitting exactly where the stranger had left it, and said only that she did not know, not yet, that 30 years was a very long time to wonder about a thing, and that she was not entirely certain she was ready to stop wondering just yet, not even for an answer. Constance nodded, understanding this better than most anyone alive could have understood it, and told her only to send word if she needed company, whatever hour it might be. And then she was gone, and Margaret was alone again with the candle burning low in the window and the box sitting quiet and closed upon the table, and the particular hush of a lane at the end of a very long day settling once more over Elderbrook Lane. She sat with it a long while after Constance left. The fire burned down to embers, the candle guttering low in its holder, her hands folded in her lap rather than reaching for the lid. There was, she found, a strange comfort even in the not knowing, a final small stretch of the 30 years she had already spent not knowing, and some quiet part of her was not yet ready to let that stretch of time come to its end, however it might end. Outside, the church bell tolled midnight, faint and distant, the way it always had, the way Thomas had once told her it would carry all the way out to any ship in the bay, and Margaret sat listening to it fade, her eyes on the small wooden box until at last, with the candle burned nearly to its base, she rose, banked the fire and went to bed, leaving the box exactly where it was, unopened, waiting, much as she herself had waited, for a morning that felt more ready than this one did. Peter Ashford, for his part, did not leave Hollowmere as quickly as he had first suggested he might. He lingered at the inn through the following week, and though he made no further attempt to call upon Margaret directly, the village could not help but notice that he had taken to walking the lanes each afternoon, notebook in hand, stopping to speak with the older residents about the harbor trade of 30 years past, about the ships that had sailed that route, about which families had lost sons or husbands to that particular stretch of coast. Mrs. Pruitt, who remembered a good deal more of those years than she generally let on, spent the better part of an afternoon with him over tea, and told Margaret afterward, with a carefulness that suggested she had chosen her words with some deliberation, that the young man seemed to be piecing together something larger than a single family's records, though she could not have said what. The vicar, too, found himself drawn into conversation with the stranger, more than once, near the churchyard where the harbor families of Hollowmere had long buried their dead, including those, like Constance's husband, who had died at home, and those, like several names carved into a modest stone near the yew tree, who had died at sea and were remembered only in words rather than bones. Edmund Sayer walked the young man through the old parish registers one afternoon. The two of them bent together over yellowed pages in the vestry, and though the vicar never spoke of what they discussed there, those who saw him afterward remarked that he seemed, for the rest of that week, unusually quiet, unusually thoughtful, the way a man looks when he has been handed a piece of a story he had long ago made his peace with not knowing. Margaret herself avoided the inn and avoided, so far as she was able, any further direct conversation about the stranger's business, though she could not entirely avoid the village's curiosity, which pressed gently against her in small ways all that week. A lingering glance here, a carefully phrased question there, Charlie Doyle asking, with the particular bluntness only a child could manage, whether the gentleman at the inn was going to explain about the candle at last. Margaret told him only that some things took longer to explain than a Friday afternoon allowed, and sent him on his way with an extra coin and a heel of bread, though she found herself, once he had gone, standing rather longer than usual at her own gate, looking down the lane toward the inn, where she knew Peter Ashford's window would already be lit against the coming dusk. She thought, more than once that week, of writing to him, of asking him plainly what else his research had uncovered, what gaps remained in the story of that vessel and its crew, whether there was more to know beyond the contents of a single weathered box. She drafted, in her mind, a dozen careful sentences she might send round to the inn, and abandoned every one of them before she ever reached for pen and paper, uncertain in the end whether she wanted the answer badly enough to risk however it might unsettle the fragile peace she had built for herself across 30 patient years. It was one thing, she found, to wonder quietly in the privacy of her own kitchen. It was quite another to invite a stranger to hand her an ending she had never fully prepared herself to receive. It was Constance, in the end, who persuaded her, gently and without any real pressure, that a conversation need not be an ending at all, that a young man who had traveled so far and taken such evident care with a box of a stranger's belongings did not sound, to her ear, like a man bent on delivering bad news so much as a man trying honestly to set something right that had been left unfinished for far too long. Margaret turned this over for the better part of 2 more days, tending her garden with rather more vigor than the season strictly required, before she finally sat down one evening and wrote a short note, asking Peter Ashford whether he might call again before he left Hollowmere, and whether he would be willing to tell her, plainly and without softening it, whatever else he had learned. She sent Charlie round with it the following morning, and spent the day after in a state of quiet, careful waiting that felt, in its own strange way, achingly familiar, though the waiting this time stretched only to the following afternoon rather than 30 years, and though what she was waiting for was not the man himself but only word of him. Peter's reply came promptly and kindly, agreeing to call the next evening, and Margaret found herself, for the first time in longer than she could recall, dusting the parlor and setting out her good china with the particular nervous care of a woman preparing to receive news she had spent half a lifetime both hoping for and dreading in equal measure. That evening, as the appointed hour drew near, Margaret lit the candle earlier than usual, and stood a long moment at the window watching the lane, watching for a shape that was, for once, not the shape she had spent 30 years watching for at all, but one nearly as uncertain, a young man's careful, unhurried walk coming up from the direction of the inn, notebook tucked beneath his arm, and whatever remaining pieces of her own story he had carried all this way to finally set down before her. She had not told Constance the exact hour of the visit, wanting, for reasons she could not entirely explain even to herself, to sit with whatever came next alone at first, the way she had sat alone with so much else across the years. And yet as she stood at the window watching the lane empty of its usual evening travelers, the bakers and mill hands making their way home before dark, she found herself grateful, in a quiet way, that Constance had at least known enough to check in on her the night before, had at least left her with the sense that whatever waited on the other side of tonight's conversation, she would not have to carry it entirely alone once it was carried at all. The church bell tolled the hour, and a moment later, the latch of her gate lifted, and Margaret drew a slow breath, smoothed her apron with hands that were, this time, plainly unsteady, and went to answer the door. Peter Ashford stood in Margaret's parlor with his hat once more in his hands, though this time he did not linger near the door the way he had on his first visit, and instead, at Margaret's quiet invitation, took the chair across from her by the fire, the small wooden box still resting, unopened, on the table between them where it had sat now for the better part of a week. He had, he told her gently, spent those days going back through every record the shipping company still held, cross-referencing names and dates and the scattered fragments of an inquiry that had been conducted, briefly and without much thoroughness, in the weeks after the vessel was declared lost. He wanted her to know, before he said anything further, that what he had found was not a great deal, that the records of 30 years ago were often incomplete in ways that frustrated even the most patient researcher, but that he had found enough, he believed, to give her a fuller picture than the silence she had lived with for so long. The ship, he told her, had been caught in an early winter storm some distance off a rocky headland to the north, a storm that had come on faster and harder than the weather reports of the day had predicted, the kind of storm older sailors still spoke of decades later as one of the worst to strike that stretch of coast in living memory. The vessel had broken apart against the rocks sometime before dawn. Some of the crew had been recovered in the days that followed, brought ashore by fishermen from a small coastal village nearby and buried there, in a modest churchyard that Peter had visited himself only a fortnight earlier, their names entered into a parish register that had sat, like so much else, forgotten and unconsulted for 30 years. Margaret listened to all of this with a stillness that seemed to Peter almost unnatural, though he had come, over his weeks of this work, to recognize it as its own kind of grief, the grief of someone who had already imagined every possible version of this news so many times across so many sleepless nights that the hearing of it, when it finally came, landed less like a blow and more like the quiet settling of something that had simply, at long last, found its proper shape. She asked him, after a long moment, whether Thomas's name was among those recovered and buried in that churchyard, and Peter told her, as gently as such a thing could be told, that it was not, that the parish register listed several names he had been able to confirm and several more that remained, even now, unaccounted for, lost to the sea in the way that so many sailors from that era simply were, without grave or marker or any final resting place beyond the water itself. It was not, Peter said carefully, the answer she might have hoped for, an answer with a place she could visit, a stone she could stand before. But it was, he believed, an answer nonetheless, as much of one as the records of that terrible night were ever likely to yield after 30 years, and he had thought long and hard, before coming to her door this second time, about whether it was kinder to bring her this incomplete truth or to let the silence continue undisturbed. He hoped, he said, that he had chosen rightly. Margaret reached across the table then and rested her hand, briefly on his and told him that he had. That 30 years of not knowing had been its own particular weight, heavier in some ways than any single answer could ever be, and that even an incomplete truth was, to her, a mercy she had stopped believing she would ever receive. She asked him, after a moment, whether there was anything more, and Peter, choosing his words with evident care, told her that there was one thing further, a detail he had debated whether to share at all, uncertain whether it would comfort her or only deepen the ache of it. There had been, he told her, a single survivor from that vessel, a young crewman named Silas Barrow, who had been pulled from the water more dead than alive by the same fishermen who recovered the others, and who had lived, so far as Peter's research could determine, a long life afterward in a small fishing village not 2 days' journey from where they now sat. Peter had found his name only recently, buried in a footnote of an old insurance inquiry, and had not yet had opportunity to write to him directly, though he intended to if Margaret wished it, for a man who survived that night might carry memories no ledger or parish register could ever record. Margaret sat with this for a long while, her eyes drifting, as they so often did, toward the window and the candle burning steady in its place. And when she finally spoke, she asked Peter, quietly, to write to this man on her behalf, to ask him, if he was willing, whatever he might remember of that night and of the husband she had spent 30 years waiting for. Peter promised he would and rose to take his leave, though at the door he paused and told her one final thing, that the box on her table had come to him already sealed, precisely as it had been packed away 30 years before, and that whatever it held, he had not looked inside it himself, believing that whatever remained of Thomas Fenwick's last days belonged to her alone to discover, in her own time and in her own way. The days that followed settled over Hollowmere with the particular hush of early winter, the first frost silvering the low stone walls each morning, the last of the garden's green retreating slowly beneath a thin, persistent cold. Margaret moved through her days much as she always had, baking on Wednesdays, tending what remained of her rosemary, sitting with Constance on Sunday afternoons, though anyone who knew her well might have noticed a certain new stillness in her, a woman carrying something newly settled rather than something merely, endlessly, unresolved. The box remained on her kitchen table, unopened through all of it, and she found she did not mind its presence there in the way she might once have expected. It had become, in its own way, another small ritual, a thing she passed each morning and each evening, acknowledging it the way she acknowledged the candle itself, patiently, without hurry. Constance, when she came on Sunday, sat a long while looking at the box before she finally asked, gently, whether Margaret intended to open it soon, or whether she meant to let it sit as it was for a while longer yet. Margaret told her that she thought, perhaps, she would open it on the anniversary, the very date each autumn that she had first placed the candle in her window all those years ago, that there seemed to her a certain rightness in closing one particular door on the same day she had first opened it. Constance nodded slowly, understanding this without needing further explanation, and reached across the table to take her old friend's hand, and the two women sat together a long while in a silence that held, for once, more peace in it than sorrow. The vicar came to call as well, that same week, something he did rarely and only when he judged the occasion to warrant it, and sat with Margaret in her parlor speaking of small things at first, the coming season, the state of the church roof, before finally, with evident care, telling her that he had known, all these years, a piece of what she had likely only just learned. He had been a young curate newly arrived in Hollowmere the autumn Thomas was lost, and had assisted, in a small way, with the inquiries that followed, inquiries that had turned up little and been quietly set aside within the year, as such things so often were in villages too small and too poor to press the matter further. He told her he was sorry, sorrier than he could easily say, for having carried that small unspoken knowledge silently all these years rather than ever raising it with her directly, and Margaret, to his evident relief, told him only that she understood, that some silences were kept out of a kindness that did not always feel like kindness at the time, and that she bore him no ill will for it whatsoever. It was Charlie Doyle, in his own unwitting way, who offered Margaret perhaps the gentlest moment of that whole strange season. He arrived with her flower and tea leaves as always that Friday, and noticing the box still sitting on her table, asked, with the plain directness of a child, whether it was a present. Margaret told him, after a moment's consideration, that it was, in its way, though not the kind of present one opened right away. Charlie considered this with great seriousness, and told her that his grandmother had once kept a jar of buttons on her mantel for years without ever using a single one, and that when he'd asked her why, she told him that some things were worth keeping simply for the keeping, not for whatever you might eventually do with them. Margaret found herself laughing quietly and unexpectedly, for the first time in that long, strange week, and told Charlie that his grandmother sounded like a very wise woman indeed. Peter's letter to Silas Barrow was sent within days, and the waiting that followed settled into its own particular rhythm, familiar to Margaret in ways that felt almost strange to recognize. Another small stretch of not knowing layered atop the 30 years of not knowing that had come before it, though this one, she found, carried a lightness the others never had, a sense that whatever answer came would arrive not as a verdict but as a gift, freely given by a stranger with no obligation to give it at all. She found herself, in those weeks, walking the lane a little more often than usual, stopping to speak with neighbors she might otherwise have simply nodded to, as though the whole village, sensing the shift in her, had drawn very slightly closer around her without anyone needing to say precisely why. The reply came on a gray, quiet morning some 3 weeks later, delivered not by post but by Peter himself, who arrived at her gate with an envelope in hand and an expression Margaret could not quite read, somewhere between solemn and moved, the look of a man who had read something himself and been changed a little by it before ever passing it along. He did not stay long. He placed the letter in her hands, told her only that Silas Barrow had written a great deal, more than he had expected, and that he would leave her to read it in whatever peace she required, and then, with a small bow of his head, he took his leave, walking back down Elderbrook Lane and out of the story he had, in his quiet, careful way, done so much to reopen. Margaret stood at her gate a long while after he had gone, the sealed letter heavy in her hands, the winter light thin and pale over the garden, and though every instinct in her urged her to open it there and then, standing in the cold, she found herself instead carrying it inside, setting it beside the still unopened box upon her table, and sitting down across from both of them, letter and box together, the whole of 30 years waiting gathered now into 2 small, quiet objects on a kitchen table, waiting, as she herself once had, for the courage of an ending. She did not open the letter that afternoon, nor the evening after, though she carried it with her, in the pocket of her apron, through the ordinary business of her days, as though its nearness alone offered some comfort she was not yet ready to test against the actual reading of it. She baked her Wednesday bread with the letter folded in her pocket, and walked it 2 doors down to Mrs. Pruitt's, and sat through their usual quarter-hour of tea with the weight of it pressing faintly against her hip the whole while, though she said nothing of it, and Mrs. Pruitt, who had lived long enough to recognize a woman carrying something she was not yet ready to speak of, asked her nothing in return. It was Mrs. Pruitt, in fact, who offered Margaret an unexpected piece of the past that week, a memory she had never before thought to share, of a young Thomas Fenwick standing at this very gate the morning of his final voyage, whistling some tune she could no longer quite recall, looking, she said, like a man with nothing on his mind but an ordinary fortnight's work and an ordinary homecoming to follow it. She had watched him go, she told Margaret, the way she watched every harbor man go, without a second thought, and had never imagined, standing there in her own doorway that autumn morning, that she was watching the last anyone in Hollowmere would ever see of him. She told Margaret this gently, and with evident care, and Margaret found, to her own surprise, that hearing it did not wound her the way she might once have expected, but instead settled something further into place, another small piece of a picture that had taken 30 years to fully assemble. The following Sunday, Constance arrived earlier than usual, and the two women spent the afternoon not in their customary quiet conversation but in a longer, more searching one, Constance finally asking Margaret outright whether she was frightened of what the letter might contain, and Margaret admitting, for perhaps the first time aloud to anyone, that she was less frightened of sorrow than she was of the letter changing nothing at all, of opening it and finding only more silence dressed up as an answer. Constance took her hand across the table and told her, with the particular authority of a woman who had buried her own husband and lived to tell of it, that no true answer, however sorrowful, was ever truly nothing, that even grief clearly named was a kindness compared to grief left to wander forever without a shape. Margaret thought of this often in the days that followed, turning Constance's words over the way she once turned over Thomas's rosemary sprigs, pressing them flat and keeping them close. She found herself, that week, spending longer than usual in the garden each morning, as though the work of her hands might somehow steady the work still waiting to be done at her kitchen table, and the villagers who passed her gate remarked, without quite knowing why, that the widow's garden had never looked so carefully tended, every stem set precisely in its place, every bed cleared of the season's dying leaves well before the first hard frost arrived to do the clearing for her. Charlie Doyle, delivering her flour that Friday, found her seated on the garden bench rather than at her usual place by the window, and asked, with his usual bluntness, whether she had opened her present yet. Margaret told him not yet, but soon, and Charlie, satisfied with this answer in the easy way children are satisfied with almost anything delivered kindly, told her he hoped it was something good, and skipped off down the lane whistling a tune that Margaret, listening, realized with a small, startled catch in her chest was not unlike the one Mrs. Pruitt had described Thomas whistling all those years before, though she knew, of course, that Charlie could have had no way of knowing that, and told herself it was only coincidence, the kind villages like Hollowmere seemed to specialize in. The vicar, too, returned once more before the week was out, this time not to speak of old inquiries but simply to sit with her a while in companionable silence, the way he had come to do more often since his first confession of what he had long known. He told her, before he left, that he had said a quiet prayer for her that Sunday, not for any particular outcome, he said, but simply for whatever peace the coming days might bring her, however that peace arrived. Margaret thanked him and found herself, once he had gone, sitting a long while by her window with the letter still in her apron pocket, watching the last light fail over the lane, the candle not yet lit, the hour not yet late enough to require it. It was on the third evening after Peter delivered the letter that Margaret finally sat down at her kitchen table, the box before her on one side and the sealed letter on the other, and decided at last that she would open them both together, the way the two halves of a single story deserve to be opened, rather than treating one as a preamble to the other. She lit the candle first, earlier than her usual hour, and set it near enough to read by, and drew a slow, steadying breath, the kind of breath she imagined she might have drawn 30 years earlier had she known, that autumn morning at the gate, everything the years ahead would ask of her. Her hands, when she finally reached for the box, were steadier than she expected, though her heart, she found, was not, and she sat a long moment simply resting her palm against the weathered wood, feeling its familiar rough grain beneath her fingers, before she finally, gently, lifted the lid. Inside, resting atop a folded square of oilcloth gone stiff and pale with age, lay a compass, its brass casing dulled by 30 years of salt air, the kind of small, practical instrument a harbor man might carry not for grand voyages but simply out of habit, the way another man might carry a pocket watch. Beneath it, wrapped carefully in a second scrap of cloth, was a single glove, its match long since lost to the sea along with everything else the ocean had claimed that night, and beneath that, pressed flat between two thin boards tied with a length of twine gone brittle with age, a sprig of rosemary so old it had crumbled almost to dust at its edges, though its shape, faint and ghostly, was still unmistakably there. Margaret sat looking at it for a long while, understanding, without needing to be told, exactly what it meant, that Thomas had carried a piece of her with him even on an ordinary fortnight's voyage he never imagined might be his last. Tucked away among his few possessions the way she had tucked away every sprig he had ever left for her in return. The whole of their marriage folded quietly into a single small, matching gesture on either side of the water. She lifted it carefully, her fingers trembling now in earnest, and held it a long moment against her palm, feeling its impossible lightness, before setting it gently aside and turning, finally, to the letter Silas Barrow had sent. The envelope was thick, several pages folded within it, the handwriting careful and unhurried, the hand of a man who had clearly taken his time and chosen his words with evident deliberation. Margaret broke the seal slowly, her breath unsteady now, the candle flickering faintly as a draught found its way beneath the door, and unfolded the pages, smoothing them flat upon the table before her, and began, at last, after 30 years, to read. Silas Barrow's letter began, as Margaret would recall many times in the years that followed, not with the storm itself but with an apology, a plain and heartfelt one, for the 30 years of silence that had passed before he found the courage to write it. He explained that he had carried the events of that night with him every day since, that he had thought, more times than he could count, of writing to the families of the men who had not survived, and had failed, each time, to find the words or perhaps simply the courage, until Peter Ashford's letter arrived and gave him, at last, a reason he could no longer set aside. He wrote that the storm had come on with a violence none of them had anticipated, the sky gone black well before its hour, the sea rising in swells that broke clean over the deck, and that within what felt like minutes the vessel had begun to founder against the rocks, timber splitting beneath them with a sound he said he still heard sometimes in his sleep even now. There had been a scramble for the ship's single remaining lifeboat. He wrote, room enough for perhaps half the crew that remained above deck, and in the chaos of that scramble, in water and darkness and the particular terror of men who understood, all at once, how close they stood to the end of everything, Thomas Fenwick had not scrambled at all. He wrote that Thomas had instead turned to the youngest man aboard, a boy of barely 17 on his very first voyage, a boy who had frozen entirely at the rail, too frightened to move toward the boat at all, and that Thomas had taken hold of him bodily, half carried him through the wreckage of splintering timber and freezing water, and placed him, by main force and steady insistence, into the last remaining space in the boat, refusing to hear the boy's protests that there was surely room enough for them both. There was not room enough for them both. Silas wrote this plainly, without softening it, for he judged, he said, that Margaret deserved the truth of it exactly as it happened rather than any comfortable version of it. Thomas had known this, he believed, in the moment he made his choice, had understood precisely what he was giving up in the giving, and had done it anyway, calmly, without hesitation, the way Silas imagined a man might do a great many ordinary kindnesses across the whole of an ordinary life, so practiced in small goodness that even the largest sacrifice, when it finally came, required from him no visible struggle at all. Silas himself, Barrow wrote, had been thrown into that same boat moments later by another crewman, more by accident than design, and had watched from it, helpless, as the ship broke apart entirely behind them, the black water closing over what remained of her. He had not seen, he told Margaret honestly, precisely what became of Thomas in those final moments, whether he had gone down with the wreck or been lost to the water separately, and he was sorry, more sorry than he could say, that he could not offer her the particular mercy of a witnessed ending. But he had seen, with his own eyes, in the last clear moment before the dark and the water swallowed everything, Thomas Fenwick standing at the rail where the boat had pulled away, one hand raised, not in farewell exactly, Silas wrote, but in something closer to blessing, watching to be certain the boat and the boy within it had cleared the wreckage safely before the sea took whatever came next from him. The boy, Silas wrote, had grown into a man now with children of his own, and had asked Silas, more than once over the years, whether he ought to try to find the family of the sailor who had given up his place that night, and had always been gently discouraged, Silas admitted with some shame, by his own inability to face the writing of such a letter himself. He hoped, he wrote, that this account, however overdue, might offer Margaret something she had been waiting a very long time to receive, not the husband she had hoped might yet walk up her lane, but the certain knowledge of the kind of man he had been in the last moments anyone had witnessed him, and the certain knowledge that his final act, whatever else the sea had taken from him, had not been fear, but the same steady, unhesitating kindness she had evidently loved him for across every ordinary day that came before it. Margaret read the letter through once without pausing, and then a second time more slowly, her hand pressed flat against the table as though to steady something that had nothing at all to do with the wood beneath her palm. When she finally set the pages down, the candle had burned low in its holder, and the fire beside her had dimmed to embers, and she sat a long while in the quiet that followed, not weeping, though she had expected, if this moment ever came, that she would weep a great deal, but simply breathing slowly and deliberately, the way a person breathes when something enormous has finally been allowed to settle. There was grief in it, certainly, a grief 30 years in the holding that did not simply vanish for having finally found its proper shape. But there was something else threaded through it as well, something Margaret would later struggle to name precisely, a kind of quiet pride, perhaps, or something closer to recognition, the sense of a story she had already believed in her heart for 30 years being, at last, confirmed rather than contradicted. She had never doubted, not truly, not even in her darkest private hours, that whatever had happened to Thomas that night, he had met it the way he met everything, steadily, without complaint, thinking of someone other than himself. Silas Barrow's letter had not told her anything her own heart had not already quietly known. It had simply, finally, given her permission to stop wondering whether she was right to believe it. She sat with the compass and the pressed rosemary and the letter until the fire had gone entirely to ash and the candle had burned down nearly to nothing. And then, rather than going straight to bed as she might once have done, she rose and walked, in her nightclothes and shawl, out into the cold garden, standing a long while beneath a sky gone clear and star-scattered after the day's earlier gray, breathing air sharp enough to sting and finding in it, unexpectedly, a kind of peace she had not felt in longer than she could easily measure. She told Constance everything the following afternoon, the whole of it, the letter and the boy and the compass and the rosemary, and Constance listened without interrupting. Her own eyes bright with tears she did not try to hide, and when Margaret finished, Constance reached across the table and took both her hands and told her, simply, that Thomas sounded exactly like the man she had always described him to be, and that 30 years of loving such a man, however the story had ended, had never once been a foolish thing to do. Margaret found herself, for the first time in longer than she could recall, crying freely in front of another person, not the private, careful tears she had allowed herself in solitude across the years, but the full, unguarded grief of a woman finally safe enough to let it show, and Constance simply held her hands and let her. The vicar, when Margaret told him a few days later, was quiet for a long moment before he spoke, and then told her, gently, that he had buried a great many people in his years at Hollowmere's small church, and had come, over that time, to believe that the manner of a person's death mattered rather less than the manner of their living, and that by every account he had ever heard of Thomas Fenwick, the manner of his living had been marked, again and again, by exactly the kind of quiet courage Silas Barrow's letter now confirmed in its final moments. He offered, if she wished it, to hold a small service in the churchyard, not a burial, for there was no body to bury, but a remembrance, a way of finally marking, formally and publicly, what the village had until now only ever spoken of in careful silences and lowered eyes. Margaret considered this for several days before agreeing, and word of the small remembrance service spread through Hollowmere in the particular gentle way such news traveled there, carried from doorstep to doorstep less as gossip than as something closer to an invitation, and by the appointed morning nearly the whole village had gathered in the churchyard beneath a pale winter sun, Charlie Doyle standing solemnly beside his mother in his good coat, Mrs. Pruitt seated on the low stone bench. Near the yew tree, Peter Ashford, who had delayed his departure a further week specifically to attend, standing quietly near the back with his hat once again in his hands. Edmund Sayer spoke simply and briefly, as was his way, of a man most of the younger villagers had never known but had come, through 30 years of a burning candle and a widow's quiet faithfulness, to feel they understood regardless, a man whose final act, whatever the sea had ultimately made of him, had been to save a frightened boy rather than himself. He read Silas Barrow's account aloud with Margaret's permission, and there was not a dry eye among the small crowd gathered there by the time he finished, and when he closed with a simple prayer, Margaret found herself standing not alone, as she had stood at so many private moments across the last 30 years, but surrounded on every side by neighbors who had, in their own quiet ways, been waiting alongside her the whole time, whether she had fully realized it or not. They set a small stone into the churchyard wall that day, near the others bearing the names of harbor men lost to that same storm, simple and unadorned, bearing only his name and the years of his life, no body beneath it, only a place at last, where anyone who wished to remember Thomas Fenwick might come and stand a while, the way Margaret herself had stood at her own window for 30 years, keeping watch over a story that had finally, gently found its ending. In the days following the remembrance, Margaret found herself turning over again and again a question she had never quite allowed herself to ask directly in 30 years of waiting. Whether she had been foolish to hope so long, whether the candle in her window had been, all this time, less a tribute than a kind of stubborn refusal to accept what some quieter, more practical part of her had perhaps always suspected. She raised this, hesitantly, with Constance one afternoon, and Constance, who understood grief in all its many disguises better than almost anyone Margaret knew, told her firmly that hope was never foolish simply because it eventually met an ending, that the candle had kept faith with a man who deserved exactly that kind of faith, and that 30 years of loyalty was not diminished one particle by finally, at long last, being allowed to rest. There was, too, a quieter reckoning Margaret found herself making with her own younger self, the woman who had stood at this same window 3 decades earlier, marking a calendar with small hopeful circles, refusing every gentle suggestion that she ought to accept what the silence seemed to say. She had wondered, more than once across the years, whether that refusal had cost her something, whether a different woman might have remarried, might have built a different life rather than tending this one lane, this one garden, this one small unwavering flame. Sitting now with Silas Barrow's letter and the compass and the pressed rosemary before her, she found she could not summon any real regret for the life she had chosen, not because it had been easy, for it plainly had not, but because it had been, in its own quiet way, an honest continuation of a promise two people had made to each other long before either of them had any notion of what it might eventually cost. Peter Ashford came to say his farewells the day before he finally left Hollowmere. His research concluded, his own small part in this long story drawing gently to its close. He sat with Margaret a final time at her kitchen table, and told her, with more warmth than his usual careful professionalism generally allowed him to show, that of all the records and ledgers and forgotten boxes he had spent 2 years cataloging, None had stayed with him quite the way hers had, and that he considered himself fortunate to have been the one to carry it to her door, however difficult a delivery it had ultimately proven to be. Margaret thanked him and pressed into his hands a small jar of her own dried rosemary before he left, telling him only that it seemed right, somehow, that he should carry a piece of the story onward with him, the way she had carried her own for 30 years. Peter accepted it with evident feeling and promised, before he took his leave down the lane one final time, that he would write to her from time to time, an easy promise to make and, as it happened, one he kept faithfully in the years that followed. Word came, too, some weeks later, in a short and simple note carried by the same post that had once seemed to Margaret an instrument of nothing but silence and disappointment. From the boy Thomas had saved that terrible night, a man now well into middle age with grown children of his own. He wrote briefly, and with evident difficulty, that he had carried the weight of that lifeboat with him every single day of the 30 years since, that he had built the whole of his life, his marriage, his children, his long quiet years of ordinary happiness, upon the foundation of a single choice a stranger had made for him in the space of a few desperate seconds, and that he hoped, however inadequately, to thank the family of that stranger at last. However many years too late the thanks arrived. Margaret wrote back to him personally, a long letter of her own, telling him that Thomas would have wanted nothing more, in the end, than exactly the life the boy had gone on to build, and that his gratitude, however delayed, was gift enough to close a circle she had wondered, for 30 years, whether she would ever see closed at all. The candle in her window continued to burn each evening, as it always had, though Margaret found, in the weeks following the remembrance, that its meaning had shifted beneath her without her quite choosing the change, the way a familiar word can slowly take on new weight simply through the passage of time. It was no longer, she realized one quiet evening as she struck the match, a light lit in hope of a homecoming that might yet still arrive. It had become, instead, a light lit in honor of a homecoming that, in its own way, already had, a flame kept not for a man she was still waiting to see walk up the lane, but for a man whose final act of kindness she now understood well enough to carry forward in her own daily kindnesses. Her Wednesday bread, her coin pressed into Charlie's palm, her quiet Sunday afternoons with Constance, each one, she realized, its own small candle lit in the same steady spirit Thomas had carried with him to the very end. She thought, too, in those quiet weeks, of Constance's own long-extinguished candle, and found herself, one evening, asking her old friend gently whether she had ever regretted letting hers go dark the night her husband died, whether some part of her had wished, even now, to have kept some small flame of her own burning still. Constance considered this a long while before answering, and told Margaret that grief, she had come to believe, did not require a flame to remain honest, that some people needed the ritual of light and some did not, and that the truest measure of love was never found in how a person chose to mark it, but simply in how faithfully, in whatever form, they carried it forward through the whole of the years that followed. Margaret thought this was, perhaps, the wisest thing anyone had ever said to her, and told Constance so plainly, and the two old friends sat together a long while longer that evening, the fire warm between them, the candle steady in the window, the whole of Hollowmere settling quietly into an early winter's dusk around them. Charlie Doyle, when he next came round with her flower and tea leaves, found Margaret in unusually good spirits, humming softly to herself as she measured out his coin, and asked, with his usual directness, whether she had finally opened her present. Margaret told him that she had, and that it had turned out to be exactly the kind of gift his grandmother's jar of buttons had promised, something worth having kept simply for the keeping, and Charlie, though he did not entirely understand her meaning, nodded seriously and told her he was glad, and that he had always thought her candle was a nice sort of thing to see on his way home in the evenings, even if he'd never known why she lit it. Margaret told him, gently, a little of the story then, choosing her words carefully for a boy of 12, and Charlie listened with wide, solemn eyes and told her, when she finished, that he thought Thomas sounded like the bravest man he had ever heard of, braver even than the soldiers in the stories his father sometimes told him. Margaret said she rather thought so too. Mrs. Pruitt, upon hearing the fuller account from Margaret over their usual Wednesday tea, sat quiet for a long moment before telling her that she had always sensed, in some wordless way, that whatever the candle meant, it meant something worth honoring rather than questioning, and that she was glad, deeply glad, to have lived long enough to see her young friend finally set down a weight she had carried so quietly and for so very long. She told Margaret, too, that she remembered Thomas as a boy himself, running these same lanes long before he ever went to sea, and that it did not surprise her in the least, hearing now what kind of man he had grown into, that he had spent his final moments thinking of someone other than himself. It was, she said, simply who he had always been. Edmund Sayre, in the weeks that followed the remembrance service, found himself returning more than once to the small stone they had set into the churchyard wall, and told Margaret, on one such occasion when their paths crossed there by chance, that he had come to think of that stone rather differently than the others surrounding it, not as a marker of absence, but as a kind of quiet monument to the very thing his whole vocation was meant to point toward, the notion that love, given freely and without hesitation, outlives whatever end the world eventually arranges for the body that gave it. Margaret told him she thought that was a fine thing for a vicar to believe, and an even finer thing to have proven true in her own kitchen, upon her own table, in the shape of a small weathered box and a stranger's careful letter. As the days grew shorter and the first true snow of the season began to gather along the low stone walls of Elderbrook Lane, Margaret found her evenings settling into a rhythm both familiar and, in its quiet way, entirely new. She still sat by her window each evening with her tea. She still watched the lane grow dark and quiet as the last villagers made their way home. And she still, each night without fail, lit the candle in its accustomed place, though now, when she struck the match, she found herself thinking not of a door that might yet open, but of a hand once raised in blessing at the rail of a sinking ship, and of 30 years of ordinary kindnesses that had, without her ever quite intending it, become the truest and most fitting memorial a man like Thomas Fenwick could ever have hoped to receive. Winter settled fully over Hollowmere in the weeks that followed, the kind of deep, unhurried winter the village seemed to welcome each year with a certain quiet gladness. Snow gathering along the low stone walls and the hedgerows of Elderbrook Lane, smoke rising steady and pale from every chimney against skies gone the soft gray-white of old linen. Margaret's garden lay dormant beneath its first real snowfall, the rosemary and lavender resting quietly under a thin white blanket, patient the way gardens are patient, trusting the spring to find them again in its own good time. She had always loved this season, even in the hardest years, for the particular stillness it brought to the lane, a stillness she no longer needed to fill with private worry, and she found herself, that first winter after the remembrance, walking her garden path each morning with a lightness in her step that Constance, watching from the window with her tea, remarked upon more than once with evident quiet joy. The days shortened, as they always did, the light thin and precious by mid-afternoon, and the whole of Hollowmere seemed to draw inward and closer together the way villages do when the cold presses in from every side. Doors opened more readily to neighbors, fires kept generous rather than sparing, the church bell somehow carrying farther and clearer through air gone crisp and sharp. Margaret's Wednesday bread became, that winter, something of a small institution beyond even its usual reach, for word of her story had spread gently through the village in the weeks following the remembrance service, and more than a few neighbors who had once simply nodded at her candle without asking found themselves now stopping at her gate on baking days simply to share a few warm words, to tell her, in their own quiet ways, how moved they had been by all they had learned. She did not mind this new attention, though she had half expected she might. There was something almost restorative in it, she found, in no longer carrying her story entirely alone, in feeling the whole small weight of Hollowmere settle gently around her rather than simply passing her by with careful, respectful silence. Mrs. Pruitt began joining her most Wednesdays now rather than only receiving a loaf at her own door. The two women working companionably in Margaret's kitchen. Flour dusted across the table, the oven's warmth filling the small room while snow gathered outside the window. Mrs. Pruitt had, over that winter, taken to sharing more of what she remembered of Thomas as a boy. Small stories Margaret had never heard before, of a young lad who had once climbed the church spire on a dare and been sternly scolded for it, of a boy who had given away his own Christmas orange to a smaller child who'd gone without, stories that filled in, piece by gentle piece, the fuller shape of the man whose final act she now understood so well. Constance's Sunday visits continued exactly as they always had, though something in their quality had changed. The two women speaking now with an openness that had taken 30 years and one long overdue letter to fully arrive at. They spoke, that winter, of things they had never quite spoken of before, of the particular loneliness of a quiet house, of the strange guilt that sometimes crept in on the good days, as though happiness itself were somehow a betrayal of what had been lost, of the slow, patient work of learning to hold grief and gladness together in the same open hand rather than treating them as opposites requiring a choice. Constance told Margaret one such afternoon that she had begun, in her own small way, tending a little more carefully to her own garden that winter, inspired, she admitted with a small smile, by watching her old friend find her way back to something like peace, and Margaret found herself deeply moved by the thought that her own long winter might have helped, in some small way, to warm another's. Charlie Doyle grew, as boys do, seemingly by the week that winter, and continued his Friday deliveries with the same easy cheer he had always brought to them, though he had taken to lingering rather longer on Margaret's step now, full of questions about Thomas, about the harbor trade, about ships and storms and the particular bravery of a man who had given up his place in a lifeboat without a moment's hesitation. Margaret answered what she could, patiently and honestly, careful never to make the story larger or grander than it truly was. For she had come to feel that its plain, quiet truth was worth a great deal more than any embellishment she might have been tempted to add. Charlie's mother told Margaret, one afternoon when she came herself to collect an order, that her son had taken to telling the story to anyone who would listen, proudly and with evident feeling, and that she suspected he thought of Thomas now the way other boys thought of soldiers or explorers, a hero all his own, discovered right there on his own delivery route. The vicar's sermons that winter turned, more than once, toward themes of quiet sacrifice and patient faith, though he was careful, Margaret noticed with some private amusement, never to name her or Thomas directly, preferring instead to let the congregation draw whatever connections they wished from his careful words. He continued to visit her cottage every fortnight or so, their conversations ranging now over a good deal more than harbor records and old inquiries, touching instead on matters of belief and doubt and the particular comfort of a village small enough that everyone's grief eventually became, in some diffuse and gentle way, everyone's grief to share. He told her, one such evening, that he had come to think of Hollowmere itself as something like a single extended household, imperfect and occasionally slow to speak plainly, but ultimately, when it mattered most, capable of gathering around its own in exactly the way it had gathered around her that pale winter morning in the churchyard. Peter Ashford wrote as he had promised, a letter arriving perhaps once a month through that first winter, filled with news of his continuing work, of other old boxes and forgotten ledgers he had traced to other quiet doors in other small villages, though he told her, more than once, that none had moved him quite the way hers had, and that he had begun, in his own quiet way, taking rather more care with each new family he approached, mindful now of exactly how much weight a small wooden box might carry for the person receiving it. Margaret wrote back faithfully, sharing small news of her own, the garden's progress, Charlie's growing fascination with harbor stories, Mrs. Pruitt's memories of Thomas as a boy, and found, in this steady correspondence, an unexpected new thread woven into the fabric of her days. A friendship born from grief that had settled, over time, into something warmer and more ordinary. The first anniversary of Silas Barrow's letter arriving fell, fittingly, near the very date each autumn that Margaret had first lit her candle all those years before, and she marked it that year not with any great ceremony but with a quiet private ritual of her own devising, walking to the churchyard in the late afternoon light to stand a while before the small stone bearing Thomas's name, laying a fresh sprig of rosemary at its base, the scent of it rising faint and green against the cold autumn air. She stood there a long while, not speaking, not needing to speak, simply present, the way she imagined a person might be present with someone they loved after a long separation finally, gently, brought to its close, and when she finally turned to walk home, she found Constance waiting for her at the churchyard gate, having guessed, without needing to be told, exactly where her old friend would be that particular afternoon. The two women walked back to Elderbrook Lane together as the light began to fail, the church bell tolling behind them, the lane growing soft and quiet beneath their feet, and Margaret found herself thinking, as she so often did now in these gentler months, of how strange and unlikely a mercy it was that 30 years of silence had finally given way to this particular kind of peace, not the peace of forgetting, which she had never wanted and would never have accepted, but the peace of finally, fully understanding, of carrying a known and honored grief rather than an endless, formless question. That winter passed, as winters do, into a spring that seemed, to Margaret at least, unusually generous in its arrival, the garden waking earlier than usual, rosemary and lavender pushing up green and eager through soil that had held its secrets patiently through the cold months. She tended it that spring with the same devoted care she always had, though the devotion, she noticed, no longer carried the same edge of private, unspoken need it once had. She planted because she loved to plant, because the earth rewarded patient care with reliable beauty, because Wednesday bread tasted better shared over a table set with fresh herbs than one set without. The garden had always been, in its way, a language of pressing things flat and keeping them close, and Margaret found that language had not left her, only softened, the way a held note softens into something closer to a hum once the urgency behind it has finally been allowed to rest. Silas Barrow himself came to Hollowmere that spring, an unexpected visit he had written ahead to arrange, traveling the 2 days' journey from his own small fishing village at an age when such journeys, he admitted candidly upon arrival, no longer came easily to him. He was an older man now, weathered and quiet, with the particular careful bearing of someone who had spent a lifetime working the sea and carrying, beneath that work, a private weight he had only recently set down. He stood at Margaret's gate with his hat in his hands, much as Peter Ashford once had, and told her simply that he had needed to see with his own eyes the woman his letter had been written to, needed to know, for his own peace as much as hers, that the words he had finally found the courage to send had landed somewhere gentle. Margaret invited him in, of course, and made him tea, and the two of them sat together a long while in her small kitchen, the same kitchen where the box and the letter had once waited so long upon her table, and Silas told her, in person now rather than only on paper, a good deal more of what those final moments had been like, small details he had not thought to include in his letter, the sound of Thomas's voice as he lifted the boy over the rail, steady and unhurried even then, the particular calm in his face that Silas said he had never forgotten in 30 years of trying. Some nights, quite hard to forget it. Margaret listened to all of it with the same quiet stillness she had brought to the letter itself, and when Silas finally rose to leave, she pressed his hands in both of hers and told him that his 30 years of carrying this alone were over now, that he had done, at last, exactly the kind of hard, necessary kindness Thomas himself would have recognized and honored. He stayed the night at the village inn, and before he left the following morning, walked once more to the churchyard to stand before the small stone bearing Thomas's name, and told Margaret afterward, at her gate, that he intended to visit again, that Hollowmere had come to feel, in the space of a single visit, rather more like a place he belonged than he had expected a strange village to feel after only a day. He kept that promise faithfully in the years that followed, returning each spring for as long as his health allowed it, and Margaret came, over time, to think of him as something like family, a final, unexpected gift among all the others this long, strange season of revelation had brought her. The summers that followed passed much as summers always had along Elderbrook Lane, warm and slow and fragrant with rosemary, Margaret's garden blooming each year a little fuller than the last, her Wednesday bread and Sunday visits with Constance continuing their steady, comforting rhythm, Charlie Doyle growing taller with each passing season until, by his 16th year, he had taken over the greater part of his father's delivery route entirely, though he still made a particular point of bringing Margaret's order himself whenever his schedule allowed it, unwilling. He told her once with a grin, to give up the best conversation on his whole route to anyone else. The village itself seemed, in the years following the remembrance, to hold Margaret's story a little differently than it once had. No longer a private mystery passed over with careful, unspoken respect, but a known and honored piece of Hollowmere's own history, spoken of openly now on quiet evenings, told to children as they grew old enough to understand it, folded gently into the fabric of the place the way all such stories eventually are in villages small enough to remember their own. New families arriving in Hollowmere in later years would sometimes ask, within their first weeks there, about the candle that burned steady each evening at the far end of Elderbrook Lane, and the answer they received now was no longer a careful, evasive nod but a full and gentle telling, passed neighbor to neighbor the way only the best stories are, growing warmer rather than dimmer with each retelling. Margaret herself grew older through those years, more slowly than she sometimes expected, her hands a little less steady with each passing season, her garden requiring a bit more help than it once had, help she found readily offered by neighbors who had, in their own quiet ways, come to consider her tending as much their responsibility now as hers alone. Constance remained beside her through it all, the two old friends growing gray together, their Sunday afternoons lengthening sometimes into whole evenings as the years advanced, each grateful, in ways neither needed to voice aloud, for a friendship that had carried them both so faithfully through so much. Edmund Sayer remained Hollowmere's vicar for a good many years after that pale winter morning in the churchyard, and though he grew stooped and gray himself in time, he never lost the particular gentleness Margaret had first come to know in him during those difficult weeks of revelation and remembrance. He continued to visit her cottage regularly, their conversations growing, over the years, into something closer to old friendship than pastoral duty, and he told her once, in his later years, that of all the many small kindnesses and quiet griefs he had witnessed across his long service to the parish, hers remained the one he thought of most often, the one that had taught him, more than any sermon he had ever written, what patient faith truly looked like when it was finally allowed to rest. Mrs. Pruitt lived on for a good many more winters after that first one, her Wednesday visits to Margaret's kitchen becoming, over time, less an occasional pleasure and more a fixed and treasured part of both their weeks, two old women working together companionably over flour and dough, sharing stories that grew richer and more detailed with each telling, until Margaret felt she knew Thomas's boyhood almost as intimately as she had known the man himself. When Mrs. Pruitt finally passed, gently and in her sleep one quiet autumn, Margaret found herself grieving her with the particular tenderness reserved for those who have shared not just friendship but memory, who have helped, in their own quiet way, to keep someone else's story alive simply by remembering it alongside them. Peter Ashford's letters continued to arrive for years afterward, growing less frequent as his own life filled with its own particular joys, a marriage in time and children of his own, though he never entirely stopped writing and made a point every few years of traveling back to Hollowmere in person to see how the garden fared, how Margaret herself fared, how the small stone in the churchyard wall had weathered another season. He told her, on one such visit when his own daughter was young enough still to hold his hand as they walked the lane together, that he wanted her to grow up understanding the particular kind of story Hollowmere held, that some of the finest lessons a person could learn about love and patience and courage were not found in grand tales at all, but in small wooden boxes carried carefully to quiet doors by people willing to take the time to deliver them properly. Silas Barrow's visits, too, continued each spring for as long as the journey remained possible for him, and in his later years, when the travel grew too much for his health to bear, he wrote instead, faithfully, letters that Margaret came to treasure nearly as much as she had treasured her own long-delayed answer, letters filled with small news of his own family, his own grandchildren, the quiet, ordinary life he had built upon the foundation of a single desperate choice made by a stranger in a sinking ship. He wrote to her once in his final years that he had told his grandchildren the whole story many times over, that he wanted them to understand, as he himself had come to understand only slowly across a long life, that courage most often wore an unremarkable face, that it looked, more often than not, like an ordinary man doing an ordinary kindness at precisely the moment it was needed most. The seasons continued their steady turning along Elderbrook Lane, each one arriving in its accustomed order, each one finding Margaret a little older, a little grayer, though never, in all the years that followed, any less faithful to the small evening ritual that had first begun in grief and uncertainty and had grown, over time, into something closer to a quiet, ongoing conversation with everything she had loved and lost and, in its own strange way, finally recovered. She continued to bake her Wednesday bread for as long as her hands allowed it, continued to sit with Constance each Sunday for as long as they both were able, continued to walk her garden each morning, tending rosemary that had, by then, spread well beyond its original borders, filling the whole of her small plot with its familiar, steadying scent. The village around her changed, as villages do, slowly and then all at once, new families arriving to fill the cottages of those who had passed, new children running the same lanes that Charlie Doyle had once run as a boy, new small businesses opening where old ones had quietly closed. But certain things about Hollowmere seemed to Margaret to remain fixed and unchanging beneath all that gentle transformation. The particular hush of the lane at dusk, the smell of wood smoke against cold evening air, the sound of the church bell carrying clear and steady over rooftops and hedgerows exactly as it always had, and the candle, of course, burning each evening in her window, a small point of warmth against the coming dark that newcomers learned to recognize and old-timers had simply always known, a fixed star in the quiet constellation of village life. There came a winter evening, some years after the events that had so changed the shape of her waiting, when Margaret found herself sitting by her window as she had 10,000 evenings before it, watching the last light drain slowly from the sky, watching smoke curl upward from the chimneys of neighbors she had known now for the whole of a very long life, and she found herself thinking, in the particular unhurried way thoughts arrive in the deepening quiet of such evenings, of everything the candle had carried across the years, hope at first and then grief and then, at last, something gentler than either, a kind of ongoing gratitude, for a marriage that had been real and true even in its brevity, for a husband whose final act had proven every quiet virtue she had always believed him to possess, for a village that had, in the end, gathered around her rather than simply passing her by, for friends who had stayed, and strangers who had cared enough to carry a small weathered box the long distance to her door. She thought, too, of Constance beside her, older now but still faithful to their Sunday ritual, of Charlie, grown into a steady, kind man himself with children of his own who called Margaret something like an honorary grandmother, of Mrs. Pruitt's stories, still remembered and still occasionally retold, of Edmund Sayre's gentle sermons, of Peter's faithful letters, of Silas Barrow's grandchildren, who knew Thomas's name now nearly as well as their own families, carried forward into a generation that had never met him and yet somehow, through careful telling, had come to know something true and lasting about the kind of man he had been. The rosemary in her garden had, by then, spread so generously that it perfumed the whole of Elderbrook Lane on warm evenings, a scent the village had come to associate, without needing the story explained, with something steady and good, the particular fragrance of patient tending, of promises kept across whatever distance and difficulty life required of them. Children who grew up on that lane would remember years later, long after they themselves had grown and scattered to other villages and other lives, the smell of rosemary on an evening walk home, and the small warm light in the widow's window, and would carry that memory with them the way Margaret herself had once carried a single pressed sprig, folded flat and kept close, a small and steady reminder that some things, given with enough patience and enough faith, are never truly lost at all. There are, in a life as long as the one Margaret has lived, certain evenings that stand out gently from all the rest, not through drama or upheaval but through some particular quality of peace that settles more deeply than usual. And this evening, with its soft snow and its low fires and its familiar unhurried quiet, has always felt to her like one of those. She thinks sometimes, on evenings such as this, of the many small kindnesses that have passed through her cottage over the years, Mrs. Pruitt's shared stories, Charlie's easy warmth, Constance's steady friendship, each one a thread added patiently to a life that once seemed, in its hardest years, to consist of nothing but waiting and silence, and she marvels, quietly, at how full a life can become even after it seems, for a time, to have narrowed down to almost nothing at all. The garden beneath its blanket of snow rests now in the particular patience of winter, every rosemary stem and lavender root drawn inward, conserving its quiet strength for the spring that will, in its own good time, call it forth again. Margaret has learned, over so many years of tending it, to trust this rhythm completely, to understand that dormancy is not death but simply rest, that the garden's stillness in these cold months is no less a part of its life than its fullest summer bloom. She has come to see her own years in something of the same light. The long silent decades of not knowing now understood not as time lost but as a season endured, necessary in its own quiet way to whatever fuller blooming came after it. She thinks, too, on evenings like this one, of the many hands that carried her story forward when she herself could no longer carry it alone. Peter Ashford's careful research, Silas Barrow's overdue courage, the vicar's gentle service in the churchyard, the whole village's quiet gathering around her once the truth was finally known. It strikes her still, even after so many years, how a single act of kindness on a sinking ship 30 years past could ripple so far and so wide, touching lives Thomas himself never lived to see, shaping a boy into a man and that man into a grandfather who told his own grandchildren, evening after evening, the story of a stranger's sacrifice, until the whole of it had grown into something far larger than the single desperate moment that first gave birth to it. The lane outside grows quieter still as the hour advances, the last few lit windows along its length dimming now, one and then another, as neighbors bank their own fires and draw their own curtains against the settling cold. Margaret has watched this same slow dimming unfold countless times across her many years in this cottage, has come to know it the way she knows the turning of the seasons themselves, each small extinguished light a marker of another ordinary day safely completed, another small portion of a long, well-lived life gently set to rest. There is comfort in its familiarity, in the certainty that morning will find the lane waking again in its own unhurried order, smoke rising once more from every chimney, doors opening onto another day of small, steady kindnesses exchanged from doorstep to doorstep along Elderbrook Lane. Somewhere in one of the cottages further down the lane, a mother hums softly to a child not yet ready for sleep, the sound carrying faint and sweet through the still evening air, and Margaret, hearing it drift past her own window, finds herself smiling gently at the thought of all the quiet lullabies that must have been sung along this lane over the many years she has called it home. Generation after generation of Hollowmere's children eased gently toward sleep by voices as patient and unhurried as the village itself. She thinks that there is something of that same quality in the candle she lights each evening, a kind of lullaby of her own devising, wordless and steady, offered now not to call anyone home but simply to mark, faithfully, that another day has been lived well and can be set down gently, without regret, until morning comes again. Further along the lane, past the last of the lit windows, the fields beyond Hollowmere stretch out white and silent beneath the falling snow, unbroken but for the faint dark line of the hedgerow marking the old boundary of the village. A boundary Margaret has walked countless times over the decades, in every season, in every weather, always finding, at the end of it, the same welcome sight of her own small cottage waiting patient and warm against the dusk. There is a particular comfort in such familiarity, in knowing every stone and gate and bend of a single lane so completely that the walking of it requires no thought at all, only the quiet pleasure of moving through a place that has, over so many years, become simply an extension of home itself. She thinks, in this final unhurried hour before sleep finally claims her, of how very little a person truly needs in order to live a full and peaceful life. Not grand fortune, not dramatic adventure, but simply this: a warm fire, a tended garden, a faithful friend, a village willing to gather close when it matters most, and a single small candle burning steady in a window, carrying forward, evening after evening, the whole quiet weight of a love that never once wavered, however long it was asked to wait. It is, she has come to believe, the truest kind of wealth a life can hold, this accumulation of small, patient devotions, each one modest on its own and yet, gathered together across enough years, amounting to something as rich and as warm as any grand fortune ever could. The snow falls a little heavier now, softening the last visible edges of the lane, blurring the line between the sleeping village and the quiet fields beyond it, until the whole of Hollowmere seems to rest beneath a single unbroken hush, gentle and complete. Margaret's eyes grow heavy at last, watching it fall, the day's small business fully finished, the evening's slow unwinding drawing at last toward its own peaceful close, and she allows herself, without resistance, to feel the particular pull of a rest well earned, the kind of rest that comes easily to those who have finally made their peace with everything a long life has asked of them. On the particular evening this story returns to, the evening it first began, that same small orange flame flickers still behind old, wavy glass at the end of Elderbrook Lane, and the villagers passing by after dark still slow their steps slightly as they draw near it, though the reason for their pause has changed, gently, over the years from careful, respectful curiosity to something closer to quiet reverence, the recognition of a story they now know and hold dear, a story of patience rewarded, not with the ending anyone first hoped for, but with something perhaps even richer, a full and honest understanding, a village drawn closer together, a friendship deepened, a grief transformed, in the fullness of time, into something that looked, on its best evenings, remarkably like peace. As the light fades further this evening, the whole of Hollowmere seems to settle, one small sound at a time, into its familiar nighttime hush. Somewhere down near the mill pond, a door closes softly, and a moment later a second door answers it from farther up the lane, the particular call and response of a village closing its shutters against the coming cold. Fires burn low and steady in every cottage along Elderbrook Lane, their lights spilling warm and amber through curtained windows, and here and there a curl of smoke rises straight and unhurried into a sky gone the deep, soft blue of late evening, the first faint stars beginning to show themselves above the rooftops. The snow that gathers along the low stone walls this evening is the fine, quiet kind, falling without wind, settling without hurry, the sort of snowfall that seems less like weather and more like the sky itself easing gently down to rest. It gathers on the hedgerows and on the gate posts and on the sill outside Margaret's window, softening every hard edge of the lane into something rounder and gentler, muffling whatever small sounds remain. A footstep, a closing door, the distant, patient toll of the church bell marking another hour safely past. Inside her small kitchen, the fire has burned down to a bed of quiet embers, glowing faint orange in the dimness, warm enough still to hold the chill at bay without demanding attention. The way a fire tended by a lifetime of careful hands always seems to know exactly how much warmth an evening requires. The kettle rests on its hook beside the hearth, its long day's work finished, and the smell of this morning's bread still lingers faintly in the room, mingling with wood smoke and the ever-present green hush of rosemary drying in bundles along the low kitchen beam, a scent that has, over so many years, become simply the smell of home itself. Margaret sits in her usual chair by the window, a shawl drawn close about her shoulders, her tea gone quietly lukewarm in its cup, as it so often does on evenings like this one, evenings meant less for finishing a cup of tea than for simply being present in the particular stillness a long day's ending brings. Her hands, folded now in her lap, carry the soft marks of a lifetime spent in gardens and kitchens, gentle and worn and entirely at peace. And if you were to watch her closely in this quiet hour, you would see nothing of worry in her, nothing of the old watchful tension that once tightened her shoulders at the sound of an unfamiliar footstep. There is only stillness now, patient and unhurried, the particular stillness of someone who has, at long last, finished the waiting she once did not know how to put down. Down the lane, Constance's own cottage sits warm and lit against the deepening dark, her own fire tended with the same careful patience Margaret's has always known. And though the two women will not see each other again until Sunday, there is a comfort in simply knowing the other is there, a light in a window not so very far away, keeping its own small watch over the quiet hours of the evening. It has always been this way in Hollowmere, this quiet knowledge of one another's presence, doors and windows glowing softly along every lane, each small point of light its own reassurance that the village, whole and entire, rests safely together beneath the same wide winter sky. Charlie Doyle, grown now into a steady man with children of his own tucked warm into their beds this evening, still walks past Margaret's cottage most days on his rounds, and still, without quite realizing he does it, glances toward her window as he passes, the way he has done since he was a boy of 12 delivering flour and tea leaves, reassured each time by the sight of that small familiar flame. His own children, when they are old enough to walk the lane themselves, will learn the story too, the whole of it, told gently by their father on some quiet evening much like this one, and they will grow up, as he did, glancing toward that window themselves, carrying the story forward the way stories in villages like Hollowmere are always carried forward, hand to hand, evening to evening, generation to generation. The church, its stone walls pale beneath the gathering snow, stands quiet and dark at this hour, its bell resting between the tolls that mark the passing hours, and in its small churchyard, beneath a fresh, undisturbed layer of white, the modest stone bearing Thomas Fenwick's name rests alongside the others, indistinguishable now beneath the snow from any other marker there, equal in the quiet dignity that gathers, in time, over every resting place a village chooses to remember. Margaret does not need to see it to know it is there. She carries it with her, has carried it for years now, not as a wound but as a settled, steady fact. The way she carries the compass and the pressed rosemary and the whole long story that once took 30 years to fully arrive. The evening deepens further, and somewhere beyond the edge of the village, where the fields lie quiet and white beneath the falling snow, an owl calls once, low and distant, and falls silent again, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the hush that has settled so completely over Hollowmere. It is the particular hush of a village fully at rest, fires banked, doors closed, the day's small business finished and set gently aside until morning. Every soul beneath every roof along Elderbrook Lane settling now into the same unhurried peace that Margaret herself has finally, after so very long, learned to carry as her own. She thinks, in this quiet hour of time itself, of how strangely it moves, rushing sometimes and lingering others, 30 years of waiting compressed, in memory, into what feels now like a single long evening, and the years since Silas Barrow's letter arrived stretching out instead into something rich and full and entirely their own. She has come to believe, sitting here so many evenings now with her tea gone cold and her candle burning steady, that time is not, in the end, the enemy grief so often makes it out to be, but something gentler, something that carries a person patiently forward whether they feel ready for it or not, softening what needs softening, settling what needs settling, asking only that a person keep faith with whatever they have chosen to carry through it. She thinks, too, of belonging, of how a village so small could hold so much quiet devotion within it. Constance's faithful Sunday visits, Charlie's easy warmth, Mrs. Pruitt's treasured memories now passed on and cherished, Edmund Sayer's steady presence, Peter Ashford's careful kindness, Silas Barrow's long overdue courage, each one a small thread woven, without any of them quite intending it, into the whole fabric of a life she once feared she might have to live entirely alone. She understands now, in a way she could not have understood 30 years ago, standing at her gate watching Thomas walk away for what would prove to be the final time, that no life, however solitary it might sometimes feel, is ever truly carried by one person alone, that a whole village had been quietly, faithfully waiting alongside her the entire time, whether she had always known it or not. And she thinks, finally, as she always does in this particular hour of love, of the plain and unadorned kind Thomas had shown her across every ordinary day of their marriage, small kindnesses rather than grand gestures, a sprig of rosemary left upon a sill, a clumsy dance in a warm kitchen, a hand raised in blessing at the rail of a sinking ship. She understands now, with a clarity that took the whole of 30 years and one long overdue letter to fully arrive at, that this was never really a story about waiting at all, not truly, but about faith, the plain, unglamorous, daily faith of choosing, again and again, to believe in the goodness of someone you loved, and finding, in the end, that such faith is rarely wasted, however long it takes, however far it must travel, however many hands must carry it before it finally reaches home. The candle in her window burns low now, its flame small and steady against the deepening dark, and Margaret rises at last from her chair, moving slowly in the particular unhurried way of someone entirely at peace with the pace of her own evening, and banks the fire for the night, and draws her shawl a little closer, and stands a final moment at the window, looking out at the snow still falling soft and silent over Elderbrook Lane, over the sleeping village beyond it, over the whole quiet world, settling gently now toward its own long rest. She does not need to wonder, this evening, who the candle is for. She knows, has known for years now, that it burns for a man who gave everything he had in the space of a single desperate moment so that a frightened boy might live to grow old, for a marriage that was real and true and worth every year of faithful tending, for a village that gathered close when it finally learned the whole of her story, for every small kindness that rippled outward from one man's final choice into lives he never lived to see, Charlie's children, Silas's grandchildren, Peter's own daughter walking this same lane with her hand in her father's, all of it carried forward, gently, faithfully, the way a single pressed sprig of rosemary carries forward the whole of a summer long after the season itself has passed. Outside, the snow continues its slow, unhurried fall, softening every rooftop and hedgerow along the lane, and somewhere beyond the edge of hearing, the church bell prepares to mark another quiet hour safely past. Margaret watches it a while longer, this gentle world she has come, at last, to hold so completely at peace. And then, when the cold finally urges her toward it, she turns from the window, leaving the candle burning steady behind her, and makes her way, unhurried and entirely at rest, toward the warm and waiting quiet of sleep. And so the lane grows still. The last lights along Elderbrook Lane dim, one by one, until only the small steady flame in the widow's window remains, glowing softly through old wavy glass. A single point of warmth against the vast, quiet dark, watched over now not by grief but by memory, not by longing but by love, burning on, patient and unhurried, exactly as it always has, exactly as it always will. For as long as there is a woman in that window, and a village around her willing to remember, and an evening gentle enough to hold them both,